Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about bees, wild bees primarily, and what's happening with them and what we can do to help them. Just bear with me for 2 ticks while I share my screen. Hopefully now you can see a lovely common carded bumblebee there. But before I talk more about bumblebees, I thought it'd be nice just to have a sort of warm up with some a little kind of introduction to the broader world of bees, which often gets forgotten. I'm sure this isn't true of people here because you're keen gardeners, but it always amazes me how ignorant people are about how many bees there are in the world. And lots of people actually labor under the misapprehension that there's just one and it lives in a box and it makes honey and it pollinates everything, which of course is a million miles from the truth. There are well over 20,000 different species of bee in the world. About 9 of which are different types of honeybee, although there's only really one of those that's widely kept as a domestic animal all around the world. And then there are about 250 species of bumblebee, the group that I focus most of my research on. But then there are stacks of others, the majority of them solitary creatures, so that they don't live in a hive, they don't have a queen, there are no workers, there's just male bees and female bees that go about their business. And females make little nests in all sorts of different locations. And those solitary bees get very little attention, and most people don't even know they exist, in fact, which is kind of sad because they're all important. So I thought I'd start by just showing you some nice pictures of some of the world's interesting bees. Starting with a personal favorite of mine from the UK, the hairy-footed flower bee. So this is one of our solitary bees. They've more or less sadly finished for the year. They're out in the spring. Big, almost bumblebee-sized bees, and very handsome. They're called the hairy-footed flower bee because, as you can see, they have this big tuft of hairs, but it's only the males that have it, and it's only on their middle pair of legs. And we don't quite know what purpose it serves, but when they're mating, the male uses his big hairy feet to stroke the face of the female, and she seems to enjoy it, so it must achieve something. Who knows? Anyway, I love seeing hairy-footed flower bees every spring. There are some bees that don't look like bees at all, that look very wasp-like, and they tend to be cuckoo bees. They haven't got fur because they don't bother collecting pollen. In fact, they behave just like the bird, and they search for the nests of a host bee species. They wait until the mother is away, and then they dash in and lay their own egg. And the egg of this cuckoo bee hatches very quickly and produces a little tiny maggot with enormous jaws, which it just has for the purpose of murdering the host, and then it eats all its food. So it seems a bit mean, but it's all, perfectly natural and part of life's rich tapestry. We should appreciate these amazing creatures just as much as the normal bees. If you leave the UK, there are some really amazing bees. So for example, look at this. I'd love to see one of these. I never have. They're found in China, so it's a bit of a trip if you want to see one. It's a type of carpenter bee, the blue carpenter bee. Another solitary bee, but a big bumblebee-sized creature. Isn't that amazing? And then just finally, while we're doing a world tour of bees, one more. These I have seen. This is a type of orchid bee from Central and South America. They're like flying jewels, amazing metallic little creatures. And they're called orchid bees because the males visit orchids not to collect pollen or nectar, but to gather the floral scents. And they have big swollen hollow hind legs. You can see the little inset picture bottom right. And they stuff them full of the scents from the flowers, from the orchids, and create a kind of floral odor bouquet. And then when they find a female orchid bee, they waft their legs at her and hope that she likes the smell they've created. Amazing beasts. If you ever get the chance, it's worth going all the way to South America just to see one of these. Anyway, if you take up trying to kind of look at bees, identify bees as a hobby, which is becoming popular these days, there are lots of people paying much more attention to the bees in their garden. One of the obstacles you will come across quite quickly is that, as well as there being lots of different species of bee, about 270 in the UK, there are also lots of insects pretending to be bees. Some of them really good mimics, and so others not so much. And of course they pretend to be bees because that gives them some protection against things that might otherwise try to eat them. So predatory birds, for example, most of them will avoid trying to eat a bee because they don't want to get stung. And if you look like a bee, then you get protection, even if you haven't got a sting. Now, much to the annoyance of the authors of this book, Bees of the World, the publishers decided to put this picture on the front cover, which I think, if you know anything about insects, you could immediately see is actually a fly. Legend has it they printed 4,000 copies before they showed the authors this, and you can just imagine how annoyed they were to find their book adorned with a fly on the cover. There are some flies that are amazing mimics of bees, and the publishers could have been forgiven for using, for example, one of these gorgeous creatures on the left there. That's a type of hoverfly, which is a really good mimic of there's a bumblebee on the right, just to give you an idea of what it's trying to copy. You can tell them apart if you're a human with a little bit of knowledge. Different number of wings for a start. The bumblebee has 2 pairs and the fly only has 1, but birds don't tend to notice that kind of thing. Anyway, then there are the bumblebees, my kind of favorite. I've been studying bumblebees now for about 30 years nearly, and I think they're really fascinating and endearing creatures. They're the commonest of the wild bees that you find in, not just in the UK, but in most of the temperate northern hemisphere, right across Europe, as far as China and through North America. As I mentioned earlier, there are about 250 different species, and nearly all of them have a similar life cycle, which is probably easiest to pick up in the spring when the big fat queen bees come out of hibernation. They've been sleeping for maybe 8 months, and they come out starving hungry in March and feed on any flowers they can find. Often pussy willow is a classic. And then when they've had a feed, they look for somewhere to nest, and they usually nest underground. And if they can find a nice, safe, dark hole in the ground, ideally with an old abandoned mouse nest in it, then they'll use that as insulation, and they'll make a little ball of pollen, and they'll lay eggs in it, and then they sit on it and they incubate it like a bird. They shiver to generate heat so they can keep their brood warm, and so it develops quickly. And if all goes well, then that first batch become workers within about a month, daughters that then take over the foraging, so the queen never has to leave her nest again. And the nest grows through the spring. This time of year, most of the bees you see are workers until we get to summer, and then the bumblebee nests produce new queens and males that fly from the nest. They mate, and that's all the males do. They don't do any work in the nest. They don't gather any food, apart from for their own needs. And they can't defend the nest because they don't have stings. Anyway, it's quite interesting that for some strange reason, there are about 7 times as many young males born as young queens. And the young queens, they just mate once with one male, and then they go into hibernation, which can be as early as June or July. And that does mean that 6 out of 7 male bumblebees never get to do the one thing that they were born to do, which is kind of sad, really, when you think about it. But anyway, and then those young queens with the sperm stored inside them from that single male sleep through the winter and start the whole cycle again the following spring, if all goes well. So I got hooked on bumblebees, as I say, nearly 30 years ago. And to start with, my interest was actually in their behavior. They're really clever. They're really good at, they can navigate over long distances. They can memorize which types of flowers are most rewarding. I spent 5 years studying the way they use their smelly feet to, so they can detect flowers that another bee has recently emptied by the odor of its smelly feet that just leaves a little whiff on the petals, which I thought was amazing when I discovered that. But as I read more about bumblebees, I realized that something had happened, that many of them had disappeared. At the time I was working around Southampton. And if I looked in books written as recently as 1970, they talked about species of bumblebee being common, and I just couldn't find them. So there's 4 examples here. It's telling me my internet connection is unstable. I hope you can all hear me. Linda, nod if I sound okay. Actually, I'll just bear with me for 1 second. I'll check I'm on the. Yeah, sorry. We've got two sources of internet signal in my house, and I was just making sure. Can you all see we're back where we were now? Yep. So species like top left there, that's the shrill carder bumblebee. It was described in these books as a common bee in the south of England, but I couldn't find one anywhere near Southampton as the red-shanked carder top right or the moss carder bottom left, and the short-haired bumblebee bottom right. They're all ones that had disappeared. And I started to worry about this and think what was happening. And I looked into it, and it turns out that there have been massive declines in many of our bumblebee species in the last 50, 60 years. So if I just give you a couple of examples, this one's the great yellow bumblebee, which is a gorgeous beastie that used to be found, as you can see, all over the UK. That's the first half of the 20th century. But as time went on, it disappeared. So that's the second half of the 20th century, and that's today. It's extinct in England and Wales. You've got a long drive on your hand if you want to go and see one of these, for most of us. And it's not alone in having declined. So, for example, this is back to the shrill carder I mentioned a moment ago. You can see here, pre-1960, it was all over the place. It was common in around London, South Wales, all along the south coast of England, and right up into the Midlands and as far as Yorkshire and so on. But as time went on, it disappeared. And when I first got interested in looking for this bee, it was known from about 6 populations. This was 20 years ago. The nearest to Southampton was on Salisbury Plain, and I found them on Salisbury Plain and did some work trying to understand more about their biology and why they were declining and so on. But actually, that Salisbury Plain population has since gone extinct just in the last 20 years. And another one, the Somerset Levels, is possibly now extinct. It's down to, last year there were 1 or 2 bees spotted. So this bee is disappearing before our eyes and could go extinct within a small number of years, which I mean, I just find this really, really sad. And of course, it's also important because we need bees, whether we care about them or not, because of what they do as pollinators, of course. And you'll be very aware of this as keen gardeners. Bumblebees are amongst the most important pollinators of wildflowers and of crops. Just to throw some figures at you, so globally, 87% of all the plant species in the world need some kind of animal pollinator. And in exotic locations, that's sometimes done by a hummingbird or a bat. But in Europe and most of the world, most of the time, it's done by some kind of insect. Not always a bee. We shouldn't forget all the other pollinators. In the UK, one recent estimate suggested there were at least 4,000 species of pollinating insect. The bees plus butterflies and moths, lots of different flies, wasps, beetles, and so on, all getting in on the act. But between them, they make sure that all of our wildflowers set seed. And if they weren't here, most of our plant species would disappear. All of our wildflowers, more or less, would disappear, which is terrifying. But also, of course, you'll be very aware, we need pollinators to pollinate our crops. Roughly 3/4 of the crops we grow in the world depend upon insect pollinators. So, you know, we're used to our supermarkets being awash with this kind of plenty of amazing array of fruits and veg from around the world, available 12 months of the year. But if we didn't have insect pollinators, things wouldn't look so good. we wouldn't have an awful lot. Things like blueberries, strawberries, raspberries, apples, cherries, pumpkins, courgettes, tomatoes, chili peppers, even things like coffee and chocolate depend upon insect pollinators. So life would be dire indeed without these little creatures. And we need to make sure we don't end up like these people. You may have seen these pictures before. They've been used many times, but I think that's because they say something really important. These pictures are taken in southwest China, and there's an area of huge areas of apple and pear orchards, which are now all hand pollinated by people because there aren't any bees left, there aren't any pollinators left, they've wiped them out. So they climb into the trees with little paintbrushes to pollinate the flowers by hand. So the pictures may look quite cute with their traditional dress and smiles and everything, but actually this should terrify us. Imagine a farmer in the UK hand pollinating his field of oilseed rape. It's not going to work. So we need to look after them better. And as I became more interested in this, I turned my research to focusing on understanding why bumblebees were declining and why certain species had declined much more than others, and so on. And we published all sorts of papers in scientific journals about the decline of bumblebees and about what we might do to reverse it. All of them published in kind of dry science. This is what scientists do, is their main business is doing research and publishing. And we try to publish in these scientific journals that are terribly dry, most of them not accessible to the public. Many of them are actually behind paywalls, so nobody reads them, apart from a few other scientists. And after about 10 years of this, I became really frustrated and started to think, what the heck is the point? Nobody's taking any of this information and doing anything useful with it. You know, we know what we need to do, but nobody's doing it. So for example, we need to make our urban areas, our gardens more wildlife friendly. We need to make our farms more wildlife friendly, put back flowers. We need to recreate some of the beautiful flower-rich grasslands, hay meadows and chalk downlands that we used to have. And we need to stop spraying everything with poison. So we knew all these things, and it seemed nobody was acting. So that's why back in 2006, together with a bunch of my PhD students, we set up the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, which is an organization devoted to trying to do the things that didn't seem to be being done by anybody else, to look after our bumblebees and our other bees too. I should say when we started it, it was an absolute shambles, and it was chaos. We made a complete mess of everything. We lost people's checks and we mistyped in their addresses into the database, so they never got their membership packs, and the whole thing was absolute amateur hour. But it isn't anymore, I should say. I'm no longer involved in running the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and it's much more professional without me. And he's doing a fantastic job of trying to look after our bees. And I'll just show you the very first habitat we created for bumblebees. This was Britain's first dedicated bumblebee nature reserve, up in Scotland, near where at the time I set up the trust, I was based at Stirling University. And this was an 8-hectare field we managed to get permission to sow with wildflowers. And it was just amazing to walk through this field. And it was even this was its first year. You can see all the annual cornflowers and poppies that flowered. The next year it was full of clovers and yellow rattle and so on. But just in the first year, it was alive with bumblebees, and it was just so nice to be able to walk through what had previously been a very boring monoculture of ryegrass with no flowers at all and no insects really to speak of. Instead, it had been transformed into this just field that was buzzing with life, which was really exciting. And since then, the Trust has created lots more habitat like this, although nowhere near enough yet to have really made a significant difference. There's a huge challenge ahead of us, but we can all help because, as Linda mentioned, we're all here because we're gardeners and we want to make our gardens more wildlife friendly. And I think there's a huge and really exciting opportunity here. So there are about 22 million gardens in the UK, covering an area of about 400,000 hectares. So it's a huge area. Just imagine if they were all wildlife friendly, bee friendly, full of butterflies and bumblebees and bee friendly flowers and so on. And if we could also get the councils on board, so that the city parks and the cemeteries and the road verges and the roundabouts were also all full of flowers, then that's a national network of wildlife friendly habitat, and that would really make a difference. And the exciting thing is that it's actually happening. There are lots of people engaging with this, already turning their gardens into little oases for insects. And there are councils buying into the idea of reducing mowing and sowing wildflowers and so on. So this isn't just a wild kind of dream. It's actually something that's already beginning to happen, and we just need to push it along as fast as we can. So you can probably tell I'm quite excited about this, and that's why I've written books about it, to try and kind of get people on board, to try and engage with as many people as possible. I won't tell you any more about the books, but some of the things I'll say I do cover in the book. So for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to focus on a very quick tour through what we can do in our own gardens to invite in wildlife as much as possible. So people think that gardening is a green activity, don't they? I mean, what could be more green than growing flowers and fruits and vegetables in our gardens? But actually, it depends how you do it as to how green it is. Gardening done the wrong way can have huge negative impacts on the environment. You know, if someone's idea of gardening is to jump in the car at the weekend and drive to a big out-of-town garden centre, one of these giant superstores, and get a big trolley and push it around and load it up with pretty flowers sold in disposable plastic pots, almost certainly grown in a peat-based compost, almost certainly drenched in pesticides. This is something we've done some research on, and we screened the plants being sold as bee friendly with the RHS Perfect for Pollinator logo on the label. And we found that nearly all of them contain pesticides. 75% of them contained insecticides, and they're being sold as bee friendly in your local garden centre. So beware. And anyway, so we're back to, you fill your trolley up with all these plants full of poison and peat and plastic, and then you get a sack of peat-based compost, and you get some bug killer, and you get some herbicides, some Roundup, and you get some fertilizer. All of these things are really bad for the environment. As of course, you know, I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but we should try and tell other people this, because many people just don't think about the impacts of what they do. And some people aspire to a garden that looks like this, which I'm sure is your idea of hell. It certainly is mine, but this is a real garden. People are actually doing this. This is plastic grass, in case you can't quite tell. There's actually a garden about 100 meters from where I'm sitting, where they've just covered it all in plastic grass. It's obviously, this kind of gardening is terrible, and I'd love to live in a world where it was just socially unacceptable to do this. But sadly, we don't yet live in that world. But we can all battle for gardens to not look like that, but to look more like this, or something very loosely like this. Because gardens managed the right way can be incredibly biodiverse and support just a huge range of organisms, as was illustrated really nicely by a lady called Jenny Owen, who lived in Leicester, had a small garden, 0.07 of a hectare, so really nothing special as gardens go. But she spent 35 years cataloguing every insect, every plant, every bird, every animal that she could find, and identifying it. And after 35 years, she'd managed to identify 2,673 different species, of which 1,997 were different types of insect. Which I think is just amazing. I mean, it sounds like the sorts of figures you might expect from a rainforest, but this is from an urban garden in the middle of Leicester. So it just shows, you know, how many species we can support in our gardens if we just make them more wildlife friendly. So how can you do that? Well, the first thing, of course, is a lot depends on what you plant. Grow the right kinds of plants. But that's a bit of a minefield because there are so many to choose from. I recently saw an estimate that there are about 70,000 different cultivars and varieties and species of plants available in UK garden centres. So it's a bit bewildering, but a few kind of rules of thumb. Firstly, avoid double flowers. There are hundreds of cultivars of common garden plants available for sale in garden centres that are doubles, which are mutants in which the anthers, the bits that produce the pollen, the male parts of the plant, have mutated instead into petals, extra petals. So if you look at the rose, bottom left, that kind of wild type dog rose, really attractive to insects. The rose above it, the sometimes called a hybrid tea, not at all attractive to insects because it's just a bundle of petals that they can't get into without any pollen anyway. So avoid double varieties and encourage your friends and relatives to do likewise. But that still leaves an awful lot to choose from. So how do you decide which ones to grow? Well, to try and provide information on this, I teamed up with a lovely lady called Rosie Rawlings, who had been conducting her own trials at her nursery. It's called Rosie Bee Nursery in Oxfordshire. She set up her own experiment. So she planted 111 different varieties of plant, all of them ones that are supposed to be good for pollinators, that are in lists of plants you might grow to attract bees and butterflies and so on. And she spent 5 years, she grew them all in metre square plots, and she counted all the insect visitors through the spring and summer for 5 years, so that we could actually quantify which were the most attractive plants to pollinators. And if you want to read this paper, it is one of those dry, boring scientific articles that I mentioned earlier, but it's open access. Anyone can read it, and it's fairly easy to understand. But just the highlights, or 2 highlights from it. One is that the overall winners were these 3 plants. To my great surprise, I must say that the plant that came out top in terms of the most insects attracted per year to a metre square of flowers was this lesser Calament, which is a plant I've never even grown myself. I've got a patch of it now in the garden because of what I learned from Rosie's study. It doesn't look amazing, it's kind of pretty in an understated way, but well worth growing because it's hugely attractive to insects. And then Helenium was second, quite a familiar North American daisy, and geranium, particularly this variety Rosanne, hardy geraniums of most types are really attractive to insects, particularly bumblebees. So all 3 plants worth squeezing into your garden somewhere if you can. Just one other result from Rosie's study is that native wildflowers on average performed better than non-native plants. Not perhaps surprisingly, because our native pollinators have co-evolved over thousands of years with these plants. So the overall top performer amongst the natives was marjoram, which is a lovely plant, and I could heartily recommend everyone should have some marjoram in their garden, no matter what size it is. And Viper's bugloss or bugloss, the blue flower in the centre. That picture doesn't really do the plant justice. It's a beautiful native wildflower that, again, I'd heartily recommend anyone to grow. So all else being equal, grow native plants, which kind of brings me naturally to the next point, which is that we should try to be as tolerant as we can of what are usually called weeds. We're taught from an early age that certain plants are to be eradicated. They're the enemies of the gardener, that on all costs. You're a bad gardener if you have these things growing in your garden. But actually, if you sit back for a second and just look at these pictures here, these are beautiful, I think, and they're native wildflowers. They're really attractive to pollinators. So why do we so obsessively persecute them? There's really no need. So if you can, be tolerant of those dandelions and don't spend ages trying to dig them up, because actually the bees will really thank you if you leave some for them. Other ways you can get more flowers into your garden to support more insect life. Plant flowering trees, there's quite a lot to choose from that are really attractive to pollinators. My favorites are fruit trees. Every garden needs a fruit tree. Even small gardens, you can squeeze in fruit trees on dwarfing rootstocks. And if you've got room for several, you can get a flowering, you can have blossom from the middle of March through to early June, which is just fantastic to look at. The bees really appreciate it. And of course, you're also locking up carbon in the tree. It's good for the soil, it keeps it held together. And you get your own 0 food miles fruit in the summer. It's just wins all around if you've got room for a fruit tree, I think. Then finally, on the flower front, and this is something I think most people are familiar with now, we should all be campaigning for everybody to be more relaxed about mowing. The less you mow, the more wildlife you have in your lawn. It's as simple as that. And it's such an easy thing to do. It actually saves you time and effort to not mow. If you're worried about it looking untidy, mow a path through the middle, mow around the edge, and suddenly it looks neat and deliberate. This is my lawn, and I haven't sown any wildflower seeds. It's just, if you stop cutting, all these lovely flowers pop up and start flowering, and bees start zooming in. So if we could just persuade people to you know, next time they get twitchy, they think the lawn is looking untidy, just relax, get the deck chair out, make themselves a coffee or a gin and tonic, whatever time, depending on the time of day, and just enjoy the wildlife rather than mowing the hell out of it all. Every time you mow, you're basically hoovering up all the insect life that's moved into the grass and mashing it up and killing it. It's pretty sad. So if we could just imagine if we get everyone's lawn looking like that, wouldn't that be great? And not just lawns, of course, the council has lots of areas that it manages that could be full of life if they weren't mown all the time. This is a road verge up in Scotland created by a little campaign group that call themselves On the Verge, that spend their weekends digging up any wildflowers that they can get their hands on, and digging up any mown grass that they can get their hands on and sowing it with wildflowers. And there are 92 patches like this around Stirling now. That's a road verge, and there's a roundabout, and there's one in a prison, there's one next in a primary school field, and so on and so on. Wouldn't it be great if every roundabout in Britain looked like that? And wouldn't it be great if we never ever had to see this kind of thing again in our streets? I'm sure you can tell what this is, and this is all too common a sight. Most councils still employ people to drive around looking for anything green and spraying it with herbicide to kill it. Why do we do that? What harm was this little bit of grass doing? You know, it probably wasn't very exciting. It doesn't look like there was many flowers or anything. It's hard to tell now, but it would have supported a few insects and a few flowers. And even if it was just grass, it's better than this, surely. I mean, this just seems like crazy environmental vandalism. And what's more, the chemical being sprayed is almost certainly glyphosate, which is not just bad for bees and obviously kills the plants, but there's pretty clear evidence that it causes cancer in people, and yet we're spraying it in our streets, along the edges of playgrounds, in parks, and so on. It's just completely nuts, if you ask me. I personally would love it if we banned pesticides completely for garden use and for use in urban areas. France has done this. Why can't we do this? And as I always say to people, I know, again, I'm preaching to the converted here. You guys don't need persuading, but the majority of the public still buy these horrible products and spray them around in their gardens, even though they're poison and they're spraying them where their dog plays or their children play or whatever, that you just don't need to in a garden. There's a whole army of organisms waiting to come to the rescue if you just leave the pests. And in fact, about an hour and a half ago, I was sitting in my garden having a beer, and there's some lupins, and one of the lupins had an outbreak of aphids on it. And as I was sitting there earlier, I saw something I'd never seen before. I knew blue tits like to eat aphids, but I saw the house sparrows that are nesting on my chimney. The females were regularly going backwards and forwards, eating all the aphids. I'd never seen that before, but I thought that was as another addition to the army of helpers in our gardens that help to control pests for us. If we just encourage them, if we just leave nature to do its thing rather than trying to control and kill all the time. So just to finish off, that's normally where I would finish, but I just wanted to flag up, firstly, that I've got a new book out in early August called Silent Earth. And also that I'm going to be launching a government petition to do exactly what I was just saying, calling on the government to do what the French did and ban pesticides for sale to gardeners, and ban councils from spraying pesticides in our streets. If Paris can survive perfectly well, then London can, the rest of Britain can. We do not need pesticides in our gardens and in our streets. So I'm going to be starting a petition and starting a campaign in early August to try and raise the awareness of this and get people thinking about it, get people stopping using these horrible chemicals. So if you could help me spread the word about that in early August, I'd be very grateful. Okay, thank you ever so much, everybody, for listening. That is the end.